Huh? No. Yeah. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Last week, as I was putting away the podium, I realized I didn't even use it. So this way I can dance. If you ask any questions, I can tap dance up here. If I don't know the answer. Of course, if I don't know the answer, Alex back there will answer it. You still have the mic? Okay. This quarter, winter quarter, we are doing sacred gifts and holy gatherings. And last week I went over, said it was divided into three parts. The first part being in December, the month of December. And it's these four things. We did keeping the Sabbath last week. Today will be acceptable offerings. That was those sacrifices that Alex had mentioned in the Exodus class last quarter. And then next week will be dedication of the firstborn, which will give us the Old Testament scriptural basis for why Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple, there where they met Simeon and Anna. And then finally, last Sunday, this will be on Christmas, will be a generous gift, the widow's offering. And Jesus made the statement that she gave more than these people that were putting in big money bags, because she gave all that she had. Okay, now for three of these classes, we don't study them very much. Leviticus, Song of Solomon, and Hosea. So for those three classes and only those three classes, we'll be doing a short introduction. Book of Leviticus, of course, it's the third book of the Bible, third book of the Pentateuch, which is a Greek word meaning 5 scrolls. So it's the middle of the 5 scrolls. Moses is accredited for much that's in there. Of course, there's some passages, introduction. There's a passage that talks about Moses being a meek man. Of course, he probably didn't write that, otherwise he wouldn't be meek, right? But he's being credited as writing that. Now, it contains many of the commandments of the law, or Torah. Torah means instruction. And, of course, many of these commandments don't apply to us today. They applied to the priesthood, and they don't even apply to Jews anymore because they had to deal with sacrifices and the temple. And, of course, the temple is not around anymore, so they can't do sacrifices anymore. It contains the second part. Leviticus contains the second part of what we know, consider the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The first part is in Deuteronomy, and the second part is here in Leviticus. And this is the only Leviticus passage that's quoted by Jesus in the New Testament. And then we have that other passage which is quoted by Peter, and we'll get to that later. Sacrifice and holiness are the key themes of the book. But it's not a favorite book of the Bible for many people. You ask them, well, what's your favorite book of the Bible? Took a survey. For a lot of people, that is Psalms. Psalms is their favorite book. And few people would say, I really love Leviticus. Reason being, there's a lot of sacrifices in there. There's a lot of blood in the book, skin diseases, bodily discharges. And some people say, well, it just doesn't apply to us. Hebrews says it doesn't apply to us. Thankfully, Jesus died so we wouldn't have to read Leviticus. Someone actually said that. If you see, not just here, you actually see it. Mentions of sacrifice in the Bible, and Leviticus definitely leads the way here. You see in the New Testament here, hardly any mentions of sacrifice here. Hebrews, of course, has a lot of mentions of sacrifice, and it says that's because the sacrifices under the Aaronic covenant couldn't take care of the sins that Jesus did. And here's a passage from Hebrews 10. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of true form of the realities, it can never by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year make perfect those who draw near. So that perfect sacrifice was given by Jesus. So, why do we need to read about these imperfect sacrifices there?
We know in the book of Hebrews it will say that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. However, what did the people back then think they were getting when they sacrificed?
They were obeying God's commands, for one thing.
Did they feel forgiven?
I'm not sure they could go on. They were doing as much as they could. And a lot of those sacrifices, they said, were for unintentional sins. They did something they shouldn't have done, then you do these sacrifices. Mentions of blood in the Bible. Look at that.
Way up there.
Yeah, Ezekiel's, it seems like for all these in where you get a lot of them in the Pentateuch, Ezekiel, you get a lot of them too. Of course, Ezekiel was the prophet. He was one of those taken to Babylon, and he's the prophet that those exiles look to for spiritual guidance. So you see a lot of that there, and of course there you see it in Hebrews, and then you see that in a lot of that, or some of that in the book of Revelation, if you're familiar with Revelation. But as I said, sacrifice and holiness were key themes in Leviticus, and it contains the 5 elements that relate to a life of holiness, that being a holy God, a holy priesthood, a holy people, a holy land that they lived in, and looking forward to a holy Savior when they would not have to offer these sacrifices that really didn't take away sins. And if you remember last week, we had this covenantal triangle, which had God up at the top, the people, and the land. So it has 3 elements of that covenant triangle. And that's from Wiersbe's Be Holy. And then the other passage besides loving your neighbor that is quoted in the New Testament is this one here from Leviticus 11:45. Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any of the swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land to be your God. This idea that I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt, that's a repeating theme here in the book of Leviticus as well as Deuteronomy. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Therefore you shall be holy, for I am holy. You shall be like me, is what God is saying. Mentions of holy. Look at that. Leviticus. And then this here is 1 Peter 1:16. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So here's the 2 passages, this one and the loving your neighbor. These are the 2 passages from the New Testament, in the New Testament that quote Leviticus.
Warner, what does it mean when it says you'll not defile yourself with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground? What does that mean?
That just means, don't do what the people of the land are doing. Keep yourself separate from doing what the people are doing. There's this passage that appears quite a bit in the books of the Pentateuch that looks like they're out of place. Why? And that is, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And that's what the people of the land were doing, and God considered detestable. So he said, don't do that. So that's just one of those passages. Don't emulate the people of the land. Has quite a bit, look here, Numbers. Leviticus only second to Numbers in the instances where the scripture says the Lord spoke. The Lord spoke to Moses mostly, and there's a few times where he spoke to Moses and Aaron, and that's when they had to get the word out to the entire group of people. And interesting here, the last verse of Leviticus, we talked last quarter about all the commands at Mount Sinai. Here it says, last verse of Leviticus, these are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. So if you want to read about all those commandments, read Leviticus. So let's look at some of these offerings. Acceptable offerings, that's the title of the lesson, but let's look at some unacceptable offerings. Right away in Genesis, we get an example of each. Cain and Abel presented offerings to the Lord. And it says here, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Now, we don't know what the qualifications are. Can we really go forward a few thousand years to Leviticus and take it back to the other side of the flood? We just know they had instructions on what to do, and they did it. So the Lord looked with favor on Abel. Abel, he's the one that gave the good offering, and Cain did not give the good offering. Of course, this did not work out well for either one of them. Abel got murdered, and Cain was the first murderer as a result of this. Unacceptable offerings. This is where priests rather than people were at fault. Now this is a passage we all know, strange fire. Now Nadab and Abihu, it's actually Nadav and Abihu is the Hebrew pronunciation. These were the sons, the two older sons of Aaron. Each took his censer and put fire into it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So they did something above that which God had commanded. Fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them. So they were completely burned up here, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord has said, among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified. Now, obviously, Moses was upset by this. His two oldest sons were killed, and Moses warned him. He got from the Lord a warning, telling Aaron and his sons who were priests, don't tear your clothes, don't put on sackcloth and ashes, because among those who are near me, you priests, I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified. Of course, the people were allowed to do the mourning, but Moses and his two sons were not allowed to mourn because they were sanctified, because they were holy. So there's the censer there, or a representative of it. And they put in some of the coals from the altar of incense and then some incense in it, and then brought that into the tabernacle area, but not the Holy of Holies. So why was it unauthorized? Some reasons given. 4 of them. Did they get the coals from the right source? Was the fire from the right source? It had to come from the altar before the Lord. There were times to do it. Morning and evening was the time to do that. Did they do it at the wrong time? Did they use the correct incense? God gave them formula for the right incense to use. This incense was holy. He said, don't make it for yourself. Only use it in service to me. So did they use the correct incense? And did they actually go inside the veil where they weren't supposed to go? So those are some reasons, possibly. So let's look at acceptable offerings. There were some requirements for these offerings. We'll look at these. Only clean animals could be offered. What do we mean by that? You hose them down?
Unblemished.
Unblemished. Animals that they were allowed to eat. These are food offerings for the Lord, so animals they were allowed to eat. Here they are, with the one at the end, fine flour. That's, of course, not an animal. But this is in the order of most expensive to least expensive. Oxen, bulls, rams, which is a male sheep with horns. goats, and then pigeons and turtle doves. And then if you could not afford that, you would offer some fine flour. For a lot of these commandments, the Lord specified what animal. Sometimes He'd give them a choice, and the gender. Generally, it was male. You shall offer a male. You can say like a sheep or a goat. Sometimes it would be a bull.
Is that because they were worth more?
Yes. If the high priest committed a sin, he had to do the bull. Expensive. Wild animals could not be offered. You can't just go out and trap an animal and say, oh, here's my sacrifice. Animals had to be perfect, without blemish, and we'll get into what does perfect mean. He'll give some examples. Animals had to be at least 8 days old before you could sacrifice them. They had to be able to spend, 7 days with their mother. The animals had to belong to the person offering it. Don't steal your neighbor's animals. And remember, David was going to make an offering at the threshing floor, and the owner said, well, let me just give it to you. David said, no, I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing. So, the animal's supposed to belong to you, and you should have paid for it. It's supposed to be a sacrifice. The animal could not be purchased from a foreigner. Leviticus 22:25. The fat had to be burned on the altar. Fat and the blood of the sacrificial animal could not be eaten. That was a problem. We didn't cover it, but that was the problem with Eli's sons. The people would come and make the offering, bring the offering, and they would want to burn the fat upon the altar. And then Eli's son said, no, we want to take it for ourselves. Don't waste it on the altar. Give it to us. And the people objected, but what could they do? The priest threw the blood against the sides of the altar. The offerer had laid his hand, one of his hands, on the head of the animal so that the sacrifice was symbolically in his place. This innocent animal shed its innocent blood in the place of the person doing the offering. The offerer, not the priest, had to kill the animal. So they didn't do the dirty work for you. You had to do it. The one exception was turtle doves, in which case the priest then did that. And then here's a sheep and the guy doing the offering. Remember what I said? They threw the blood against the altar.
I wonder, I can relate a lot of this stuff to Christ later on, the offerings.
Yes.
Without blemish, must be perfect. The blood being spattered when you first sign.
Yeah. But you see any blood there? I did a Google search. This came there. I did a Google search. I want to see an altar that's covered with blood. I tried and I tried and I tried. You cannot find any blood in any of the images. There's no blood on the ground. Like I said earlier, it's not a favorite book. People are not good about blood and everything, so you will not find that. Or at least I couldn't. So here's some sacrifices. There's a ram. 5 major sacrifices. Don't worry, the donkeys are safe. They're not a clean animal. So, Leviticus 1 through 7 lists all the sacrifices. There's the burnt offering. Of course, you've heard the joke about, they asked the newlywed, how's it being married? He says, it's fine, but I think my wife thinks I'm a god because every day she presents me with burnt offerings. Then there's the grain offering. Terrible? Okay. Then there's the grain offering. Then there's the peace offering or fellowship offering. Then there's the sin offering. And then there's the guilt offering. These are the 5 offerings. And if you notice the pattern here, You got burnt offering, chapter 1, grain offering, chapter 2, peace, chapter 3, sin, chapter 4 through 5, and then guilt offering, chapter 5. And then once you cover them, then you go back, chapter 6 and 7, on each of those offerings and give more detail on them. So you do the overview first, and then you go back and you do more details. So first one is the burnt offering. It's covered in, there's the chapters. Leviticus 1 through 17 covers in detail, unless you want to read about cutting up the animal, you want to read about liver and kidneys and intestines and all that stuff, you read that. I'm not going to read that. Leviticus 22, 17 to 20 then summarizes the burnt offering. Then 6, 8 through 13 summarizes all the work that the priests have to do in offering the burnt offering. Here's one thing interesting for the burnt offering. The priest is allowed to keep the hide, except in the case of a sin offering. He can keep that, and that's valuable. He can use it for himself, or he could sell that. The biggest difference then between the burnt offering and other offerings is that to make this offering, the entire animal is burnt upon the altar, with the exception, I said, the hide if it's not a sin offering. And this is symbolizing total commitment or surrender to the Lord, to God. The God gets everything here. The priests don't generally. Sometimes the priests get to eat some of this, and the offerer gets to eat some of this. Since the animal is burnt to ashes, as I said, none of it is eaten. Okay, here is Leviticus 22, 17. For acceptable offerings, the Lord says to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel, and say to them, when any of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel presents a burnt offering as his offering, for any of the vows or free will offerings that they offer to the Lord." So burnt offerings can be for vows that you've made, and it can be for free will offerings. Think of the vow that Hannah made to the Lord. You know, if you give me a son, I'll dedicate him to the Lord. Think of Jephthah's vow. Of course, he didn't make a good vow there, did he? He says, if it is to be accepted for you, it shall be a male without blemish of the bulls or the sheep or the goats. Bulls, most expensive. Goats, less expensive. You shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be acceptable to you. Now, why would you offer it? Why would you sacrifice this animal if you know the Lord is not going to accept it? And likely he's going to be mad at you for thinking that you can pull the wool over his eyes by offering this. So how long does a burnt offering take? How much of the time does it take? If you're turning it into ashes. We have that here, Leviticus 6, 8. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth, on the altar of the night, until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it." So that is roasting on the fire all night. And the priest has to make sure the fire doesn't go out. So now the priest is doing a change of clothing. He puts on his linen garment and puts his linen undergarment on, and then he takes the ashes out of the fire and of the burnt offering and sets them beside the altar. So he's changed his clothes, changed his undergarment, taken the ashes off, and sets them by the altar. Then he takes off those garments and changes clothes again. And then he carries the ashes outside the camp to a clean area, to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not go out. And that's the priest's responsibility to make sure that happens. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and he shall arrange the burnt offering on it, and it shall keep on it the fat of the peace offerings. Fire shall be kept burning continually on the altar. It cannot go out. So that's a lot of work.
Werner,
Yes.
can we pause a moment? we're going to be talking about sacrificing for quite a bit of time here. And what I wanted to ask you, I think I know, but I wanted to get your feeling on it, is why do we sacrifice in these days? What did God get out of a burnt cow or a dead pigeon or whatever? What was he getting out of this? I mean, he could get plenty of animals and so forth.
He got a pleasing aroma, one thing.
Okay.
Obedience.
I think you
You know-
touched on it in one of your slides where you said it was symbolic atonement.
Yeah. It was a sign, too. We'll get that in another one there, too.
Well, I mean, if you're going to talk about all these sacrifices, I'd like to know why we're doing it, or why they want to do it, and why we don't do it today. Sort of-
We don't have to. Hebrews 10. Yes. Think about this. Offer your body as a living sacrifice.
Holy.
Is our body perfect? It doesn't have to be. We're not doing a sin offering. Jesus did the sin offering.
I totally agree with
We're,
that.
we're doing a free will offering.
But why were we sacrificing perfectly good bulls and so forth back in the day?
Yeah.
And if anything, it had to be symbolic.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons Leviticus is not a favorite book of the Bible for a lot of people.
It involved ritual and ceremony and obedience.
He said ritual and ceremony and obedience. Yeah. Obedience is important.
Was
Yeah.
in preparation for people to be able to understand then that Jesus was going to be that perfect, unblemished thing that got sacrificed later on. You know, they were still sacrificing up until the time of
Yeah.
Jesus. So then it was in that preparation of the people to understand that that was the ultimate sacrifice then.
And God was serious on this. Say Nadab and Abihu didn't do it correctly. Who cares? Well, God did. A grain offering. When anyone offers a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be a fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. I Googled, can you eat frankincense? Yes, you can. It better be prepared correctly. And bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall take from it a handful of fine flour and oil and all of the frankincense, and the priest shall burn this as his memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is most holy part of the Lord's food offerings for Aaron and his sons, for the priests. We have that instance where David went to the priest of Nob and he gave him some of this bread, this showbread, which was only supposed to be for a priest. Now notice here we got an if. If you offer a grain offering, so this is this is a voluntary offering. This is not something you have to do. If you offer a grain offering, we'll look later. Some of these were voluntary. Some of these were mandatory. If when you offer a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits fresh ears roasted with fire, crushed new grain. And you shall put oil on it and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. And the priest shall burn as its memorial portion some of the crushed grain and some of the oil with all of its frankincense. It is a food offering to the Lord. So remember the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We talk about frankincense for anointing bodies. You can also eat frankincense. So the peace offering, this is the third of the five. When anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering, we'll see something interesting at the end of this, from the herd or from the flock. So this is oxen and bulls or rams and sheep and goats. In order for it to be accepted, it must be perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. And now he tells us, what are the blemishes? Blindness, disabled, mutilated, or having a discharge or an itch or scabs. mentions these things. These were conditions that also disqualified a priest from serving. Priests, their bodies, they had to, had to be free of all these things. And later on, if somebody didn't like a priest, they didn't want to kill him, they wanted to get rid of him, you mutilated him. You cut off an ear. You can't hide that. He can't serve as a priest anymore. You shall not offer to the Lord or give them to the Lord as a food offering. So any of those disabilities you shall not. You may present a bull or a lamb that has a part too long or a part too short for a free will offering. Does that just mean that they limp or something like that? But for a vow offering, it cannot be accepted. So there, if you're doing a free will offering, this is of your own free will, then the animal does not have to be without blemish. The sin offering. And the Lord spoke, this is Leviticus 4, to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments. You see all these lawyer commercials, if you had an accident and it's not your fault. If you sin unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and you do any of them, so there's things you shouldn't do, and you do it. If it is the anointed priest, if it's the high priest who sins, thus bringing guilt upon all the people, then he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd. This is an expensive offering, without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering. So if the high priest sins, then that sin is counted toward the entire congregation. So he has to give the most expensive of the offerings. Now, I did some research. I came up empty. How much does a bull cost? How much does a sheep cost? How much do these things cost? I could not find it. So here is, chapter 4 goes on to cover the whole range of people from the high priest down to just the common person. So the high priest presents a bull, and for the whole congregation, it's also a bull, because he said when the high priest sins, the whole congregation has sinned. So a leader of the people, remember he talked about appointing those 70 judges, clan leaders, tribal leaders like that. They would sacrifice a male goat. The common person sacrifices a female goat or a lamb. And that takes us through the book of Leviticus. And all it does for each of these is describes how the sacrifice is done. So the guilt offering, this is the fifth. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith, what that is, if you look, it depends upon your Bible version. I looked at 5 different Bible versions, and they all, if you do something wrong and you sin unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, for the guilt offering. Now, I thought this was kind of strange, and Bible scholars think there's something missing here. Because every place else where the word shekel is mentioned, a specific amount is mentioned. But this doesn't mention it. According to the shekel of the sanctuary. So you put a value on this ram, a monetary value on this lamb. Then he shall also make restitution for what has been done amiss in the holy thing, and he shall add a fifth to it and give it to the priest. So you put a value on this ram. This ram is worth 10 shekels. Then you add a fifth. A fifth of it is 2 shekels. So you're bringing the ram to be sacrificed, and you're also bringing 2 shekels, and you give this 2 shekels to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and he shall be forgiven.
I have a question.
I don't know why.
My question is about getting the ram from the flock did the people have their own flocks, or was there a community flock that they would take it out of? What do they mean by the flock?
The flock. I don't think everyone had their own because they were purchasing them.
So they would.
Remember, Jesus was upset by the money changers in the
Right.
temple. People would come from long distances, and you can't bring a lamb or a sheep with you on that long distance because it's going to be injured on the way. So you would pay these, and of course these animals that you purchased at the temple were guaranteed to be without blemish. No one questioned it. So that they would generally purchase that. And we'll get to a little bit later about if the journey is too far for you. So unacceptable animals, we talked about some of those. Any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you shall not offer to the Lord. You shall not do it within your land, neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animals received or purchased from a foreigner. We talked about that earlier. Since there is no blemish since there is a blemish in them because of their mutilation, they will not be accepted for you. And like the other one, same conditions disqualified a priest. There were no eunuch priests. So you shall keep my commandments and do them. I am the Lord, and you shall not profane my holy name by disobeying my commandments, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the Lord. And this is just God stating his authority. They asked Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? And God is continually stating his authority. I am your Lord who brought you out of the land. I brought you out of slavery. I am the Lord. I am your God. So, that's of course cut off for me, but here are the 5 different sacrifices. And you see here that these top 3 here are voluntary sacrifices. And then the bottom 2 are mandatory sacrifices. These, you see, involves thanksgiving, thankfulness to the Lord, general thanksgiving, that sort of thing. Now, these burnt offerings is just a general category. These offerings here can be burnt offerings too. Now, the sin offering, that makes you think, well, you committed some sort of sin. But when Mary came to the temple, she sacrificed a pigeon as a sin offering. But you can here see sin offering was to make someone who was unclean to attain their purification. Due to the birth process, she, of course, lost blood, and that made her unclean, and she couldn't come into the temple. So that's why she had to make that sin offering there at the court of the women before she could go up those stairs through the court of Nicanor, because she was impure. Okay, offerings to the Lord. Location, location, location. You just couldn't do it anywhere. Leviticus 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the people of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. If any one of you, anyone of the house of Israel, any of the Israelites, kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, well, what happens? Blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, animal blood, but he has shed blood. And that man shall be cut off from among his people. Now, of course, they were allowed to kill animals to eat, but in this instance, he's doing it for the Lord, but he's doing it at the wrong place. So his sacrifice is not going to be accepted, and blood guilt shall be charged to that man. That's in Leviticus. 40 years later, Deuteronomy, new generation. We're about 6 weeks from them. They're camped at the plains of Moab. They're getting ready to go into the promised land. And Moses is reminding these people, he's not going to be long with them for more than a couple of weeks. He's going to go up to top Mount Nebo and they'll never see him again. So take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you. So he's letting them know, once you cross into that land, there's going to be a place that the Lord chooses in one of your tribes. We know that tribe is Judah. The place, Jerusalem, the temple. So, once you get there, you need to do this at the temple.
On that last scripture about the individual being cut off from the people, is that he was kept away from, he stayed away from the camp for a period of time, or are we talking about him actually losing his life?
I've seen instances of both of them. Both of them. And I think the Lord, some of these, the judges will decide. If they can't, they come to Moses. If Moses can't decide, then the Lord will make the decision. We had that in the case with the man picking up sticks. We had a case of a young man, a son, who was not honoring his father and his mother, and he blasphemed the Lord. They didn't know what to do. The Lord said, stone him. Moses didn't make the decision. So what about the place? Tabernacle is the place you do this. Later the temple, during the time of Solomon. They have one altar. 7.5 foot long, 7.5 foot wide, and 4.5 foot tall. 4 priests. 2 after Nadab and Abihu. We talked about all the work that those priests did, pretty much 24/7. You had 3 of them, or you had 5 of them, Aaron and his 4 sons. After Nadab and Abihu, you just cut your workforce by 40%. Burnt offerings required the entire night. Did they have a big audience they had to serve? 6,000 men plus women and children. 600,000 men plus women. Imagine doing sacrifices for 600,000 people with 3. Yeah. And you're up all night. During the day you're doing these, up all night you're doing, the priests are constantly keeping that fire going. How many sacrifices could they perform? Now, as I said, a lot of these are voluntary. Here's a replica of the tabernacle. It's actually in southern Israel and is to scale. How would you like to have the job of getting all the firewood? Of course, that was 3,500 years ago. Maybe there were more trees. And there's all the areas. Now, we tend to think of tithes, don't we, as our offerings. There were actually 2 tithes. First tithe was for the Levites, 10%. And out of this 10% that the Levites got, they tithed 10% to go to the priests. But there was a second tithe. But the second tithe went to yourself. The second tithe from the remaining 9/10 that you had left over was set apart and eaten by the offerer's household while visiting Jerusalem. It was expensive to go to Jerusalem. So you had to dedicate 10% of your income to pay your expenses while you were there. Those who lived far away from Jerusalem could convert the tithe of the land into money and then take the money in Jerusalem and spend the money there. But then they had to add 1/5 to its price, like they did on that other sacrifice. All the tithes were proportional to the size of your crop. And this is interesting here. Some say that you could not eat your harvest until you pay that tithe. Because of the liabilities, because of your payment to the priests and to the poor, you also paid to the poor. 4 times in a cycle of 7 years, a second tithe was paid, and you used that money to cover your expenses when you went to Jerusalem. Second tithe aimed at improving the socio-economic infrastructure of the city. So, your tax dollars at work there in Jerusalem. So here it is here. You shall tithe of the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God in the place that somebody's going to ring the bell to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain and your wine and your oil and your firstborn of your land and your flock and all that you learn to fear the Lord your God. If the way is too far from you, then you convert this into money and take it with you. And I thought this is kind of interesting here. Then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place that the Lord your God chooses you. Of course, that would be Jerusalem. And spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. Is this God? You can buy strong drink. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household, and you shall not neglect the Levite who is in your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. And thank you for your comments. I think we set a record for comments today. Sure we'll have more. Next week is, dedication of the firstborn. So we'll get the basis for it in Exodus, and then we'll go to Luke when Jesus is 40 days old, they go to the temple.
I've never read that.
What's that?
About anything your heart's desire.
Yes.
Strong drink.
Strong drink. What did they have as strong drink? I don't even know. Maybe rye, whiskey, bourbon, whatever.
Fermented wine.
Yeah. Strong drink.
Interesting.